They call it Bedlam for good reason. Oklahoma State, they get it on in the regular season finale, as is customary in the Big 12. Although the Big 12 got away from this for a few years. I don't know why. This is the way it should be. Oklahoma State, Thanksgiving weekend. They play Saturday night, 8 o'clock Eastern time, 7 Central. We got Jason Ray on the line from Last Word on College Football to help us break down the Sooners and the Cowboys. Different incentives on both sides, but the one they can share in common accord is that it's about pride and bragging rights in the state of Oklahoma. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. It's Thanksgiving week. I mean, it's a great, one of the best football, whether you're college or professional football, one of the best football weekends of the year.
It is, and this is one of the reasons why. So college football is distinguished by a number of things in my estimation, and this is one of them. The rivalries don't compare in other sports. And everybody's got one, and everybody's got a good one, and this is one of the very best, and it's in state, which makes it a little bit cozier in regards to rubbing shoulders with the other side constantly every day, and having those bragging rights or having to lick your wounds and drop your head for the next 365 days. And obviously Oklahoma's had the upper hand in this series, even though the Cowboys have been much better with Mike Gundy at the helm in the last 12 to 15 years. So before we dive into the 2019 version, Jason, your thoughts about the rivalry and what distinguishes it?
Yeah, Mark, I think as you mentioned, the in-state rivalry gives a little bit more to it, just in terms of, recruiting obviously is a big thing, bragging rights, and then I think Oklahoma State in the past has relished at the opportunity to, kind of ruin Oklahoma's season. There's been so many times, especially in the last 8 to 10 years, where this game, certainly to your point, has been on Thanksgiving weekend, but also has been a game in which Oklahoma State has the opportunity to play spoiler, whether it has been, there's been a couple of times where the game has been for an outright conference championship before they went to the Big 12, went to back to the championship game model a few years ago. And then certainly, Oklahoma State's had the opportunity to, knock Oklahoma out of the Big 12 championship game a couple of years ago, the last couple of years, and then certainly knock them out of the playoffs. And they just haven't been able to do so. Oklahoma seems to always find a way to win. I remember last year, Oklahoma didn't play well, certainly on defense, and Oklahoma State played, pretty well in that game. Tylan Wallace, I think he had over 200 yards against Oklahoma in that game, and it was really just kind of a bad pass on the 2-point conversion late that let Oklahoma survive. But what Oklahoma has done well is they've played very well in Stillwater over the last few years. They've won pretty convincingly over the last three games that they've played with a lot on the line. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. At Oklahoma still, I think it's still been since Texas for whatever reason. They haven't put a full game together. You thought you might see that Saturday, and they opened up extremely well, 21-0 early on in the second quarter, and then just kind of fell apart. I think certainly part of it was on Jalen and the turnovers late. That's what kind of really kept TCU in the game. But I think if Oklahoma can put together a full game, a complete game, I think they should be able to win comfortably. But that's a big if, and something that they haven't done in a while. So I wouldn't expect anything less than another one possession game down the stretch.
To your point, Jason, if you just look at the two teams' performance over the past month, it's tough to distinguish that one team's better than the other. Oklahoma, of course, is 10-1 right now, playing for a playoff spot in the Big 12 championship again. Oklahoma State comes in with a nice season at 8-3, 5-2, one of their better seasons over the last couple seasons. But over the last 4 weeks or so, Oklahoma's struggling to beat teams Iowa State took them down to the wire. That was a 2-point conversion situation. You mentioned the TCU comeback. Oklahoma State, not necessarily annihilating teams, but they've beaten some really good. They've both generally, aside from the Kansas State game in the last month, have beaten the second tier, those good, decent teams, TCU, Iowa State, those type teams. Oklahoma State was just a touchdown win against West Virginia, who struggled this year, but they look like the results look about the same. But your thoughts about Oklahoma State's chances in this and what's going to have to happen for them? Obviously, Chuba Hubbard is one of the very best in the business, and he's going to be the focal point of the offense.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's been a big credit to Mike Gundy and the coaching staff for Oklahoma State on how well they've done, particularly down the stretch with the injuries, with Tylan Wallace going down, and then certainly last week Spencer Sanders going down with a thumb surgery for the rest of the year. I do think Oklahoma State has a chance in this game. I believe it's a 9 or 10 point spread, which hasn't meant that much for Oklahoma over the last couple of games. I think they were an 18-point pick against TCU, and then I think they were about the same, maybe a little bit less against Iowa State. So certainly the point spreads haven't really mattered the last 3 or 4 games for Oklahoma. But kind of back to Oklahoma State, I think you'll certainly see a high dose of Chuba Hubbard in this game. Certainly, Drew Brown making a second start at Oklahoma State performed pretty well. Against West Virginia, didn't have off the chart numbers, but I think he completed over 75% of his passes. He didn't turn the ball over, 2 touchdowns, and without an interception. I think what you'll see out of the Oklahoma State team, particularly him, he's more of a drop back passer, more in the mold of a Mason Rudolph than he is. He's more of, I wouldn't say necessarily a statue back there, but he certainly doesn't have the movement of Spencer Sanders. So in this game, you would expect him to be pretty amped up. Like I said, getting just that second start. I think they'll certainly run Hubbard quite a bit early, just to kind of let him settle into the game a little bit, and then put him in good position to be successful, just in terms of no easy, predictable passing situations, to let the Oklahoma defensive front kind of take control of the game a little bit, and then try to exploit the Oklahoma secondary a little bit. They played pretty well, really well actually, against TCU defensively, but they're still undersized. I don't know that Oklahoma State has the weapons to stretch the field as much as they would with certainly with Tylan Wallace in there. But yeah, and I think the one thing to think about from Oklahoma State, they've been kind of like Oklahoma. They've been much maligned on the defensive side of the ball, but they've only yes, it is West Virginia and it is Kansas, but they've only given up 13 points in the last 2 games. So their defense has improved, kind of allowing that offense to find its rhythm without those 2 starters.
What Oklahoma State is missing on offense with Wallace out of the lineup is 53 catches, 17 yards per catch, and 8 touchdowns. He being their big play guy. Dylan Stoner's been in the program for quite some time, and he's the number 2 guy. Chuba Hubbard just having an outstanding season, over 1,600 yards, 6.4 per carry, 20 touchdowns. Spencer Sanders was a big recruit a few years ago. He's been elevated to the starting job, as we talked about, but obviously he's out for this one. But he's had his issues: 16 touchdowns, 11 picks, and about a 58% passer. Drew Brown had experience at Hawaii and took over the job here after there was a big quarterback battle with like 5 quarterbacks taking play in the competition in August. You mentioned this before we started to record, Jason, in regards to Oklahoma fans and their thoughts about making the playoff again. Now, I don't necessarily understand this, because you're Oklahoma. You should be ready to jump at a championship shot anytime you can get it. And it's not like they were a disaster in the playoff. They lost the 2 games against Georgia and Alabama, but they made a nice comeback against Alabama. Probably were never reasonably in the game.
Right.
Played a lights out second half and were a respectable score away from making it really interesting. And then in the Georgia game, they played Georgia as well as anybody could. They took them right down to the wire, went to overtime, certainly showed up and were just as good as Georgia in regulation. But there's maybe some thoughts that because of some defensive liabilities and maybe the quarterback isn't quite as good as the last 2 have been, that they don't want to be embarrassed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the general thought, kind of unfortunately. And, and I agree with you. I don't really necessarily subscribe to that same school of thought. I firmly believe that, it's always better, to your point about having a chance to play for a championship versus being on the outside looking in. I think you'd almost rather lose in the first round again than maybe win a Sugar Bowl game against Georgia or Alabama or whoever that might be. And, I think one thing that's interesting as we, kind of as you think about this and you talk about this, for this team this year, the narrative that me and you have talked about, over the last 3 years is can this defense win a national championship? Can the offense play well enough against a Clemson, against an Ohio State, against an Alabama, against an LSU, certainly this year, to win, a game or win a national championship? Now, this year, maybe that narrative's turning around a little bit. I think more of the thought is, can the offense score enough points against a really good defense to win a national championship? It's interesting. Oklahoma's ranked 25th in the country in total defense. I think that the amount that they've improved, I know they had a couple of games where they struggled a little bit against Kansas State, and then certainly against Baylor for a half. But the last 6 quarters they've played outstanding defense. They've only given up 2 touchdowns in the last 6 quarters. Then of course they gave up Jalen Hurts with a pick 6. It was the other touchdown against TCU. And then they held Baylor to about 80 yards in the second half, and TCU had about 200 yards of total offense for the entire game last week. So I mean, a lot remains to be seen, but you kind of look at it, and the question is, can Oklahoma score enough points to beat LSU against LSU's certainly not at the level from defensively as probably in Alabama or Auburn or Georgia this year. But you're going to have to score. I mean, you're going to have to score in the 40s probably to beat them in the playoff game. And can this team do it? And you can see, again, one thing that we talked about earlier in the year was Jalen Hurts' inability to get the ball down the field. I think Riley's been able to mask that, a little bit through the year, and I think Jalen had improved early in the year, but he seems to be regressing a bit here towards the end of the year. He was barely over 50% against TCU. He has a propensity to not want to stay in the pocket. He wants to, he kind of wants to leave the pocket as quickly as he can. And I think you saw Riley last week against TCU just utilize the run game, particularly, I mean, him and Kennedy Brooks. I think Oklahoma ran for over 300 yards in the game. Probably those two combined carried the ball for over 300 yards. So, again, I think probably that's the hesitation that Oklahoma fans probably would have about getting to the playoffs. Now, if you had the 2018 offense with the 2019 defense, then I think you would see a different level of kind of enthusiasm for Oklahoma fans getting into the playoffs. But as we talked about offline, off camera, if they keep winning, they're probably going to get there, whether whether the fans want them to or not, right? Right. I mean, I think you have a top, the college football rankings come out this week. I think Oklahoma State was 21st last week. Certainly they won't be no worse than 21st, probably in the top 20. And then you have Baylor with their win over Texas, and then a certain win over Kansas this week. I would expect. They'll be firmly in the top 10. For that matchup, the Big 12 championship game. So, given that Utah plays Colorado, and I don't know how much benefit they would get from an Oregon win, should they get there. So, I think there's a pretty good chance if they win, you could almost say that they control their own destiny at this point.
All right, Bedlam on tap Saturday night in Stillwater. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking it down with courtesy Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football. Please check him out and the rest of the fine folks there at Last Word on College Football as they get you set for rivalry week. And of course, lock it in right here. Like, comment, share the videos, and subscribe right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Jason, have yourself a happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy all the football and the fun and the family and the food this weekend.
All right, same to you, Mark. Thanks for having me on.